Welcome, welcome everyone. We are going to get started in 2 minutes. Feel free to say hi in the chat. For everyone just joining, hello. We're going to wait 1 more minute as folks are coming in, and then we'll get started. Feel free to say hi in the chat. Love seeing some familiar names popping up there, people from all around the world. Hello, hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Alrighty. We are having people sign in from all over the world. It is so great to see so many people here. I am going to get started, but people will keep trickling in, and that is great. So, welcome. We are so excited to welcome you to our webinar at the intersection of participatory grant making and trust-based philanthropy. As folks are already doing, we invite you to say hello in the chat. It's always really nice to hear where people are dialing in from, and feel free to share what's bringing you joy in this work. I think sometimes when we center joy, and you'll hear joy pop up as a value later on, it's one way to connect and kind of remember why we're all here. So feel free to include that in your hellos in the chat. A quick note on accessibility, we do have captioning for this session, so you can access that at the bottom of your screen by clicking the CC button. If you don't see that, it might be in something that looks like a ... that says more. So feel free to turn that on if you would like, and not if you don't want. By way of introduction, my name is Jen. It's really nice to meet you all. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm calling in from Chicago. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute yourself. You should have come in muted, so don't unmute. That can be a technological nightmare on a call like this, so please keep yourself muted if you can. For a visual description of me, I'm a white lady with black and clear speckled glasses, a black headband, and long red hair, and I am using the Zoom filter that cleans up my face and makes me look a little more polished than I looked on my own. I currently work with the Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, and some of you might know me from my past work at Candid, where I collaborated with a fabulous group and Cindy Gibson to write the guide on participatory grant making for Grantcraft, which is now known as Candid Learning. So why did we want to do this session? Well, frankly, it's high time. We've been wanting to do this for a really long time. The trust-based philanthropy community and the participatory grant-making community have a lot of overlap in our frameworks. And we also share a deep belief in what we do and how we do it. And we want to share that excitement about these frameworks with you. And importantly, we want to push all of our thinking forward together. I can say honestly that even from the pre-conversations that we had as two communities talking with each other, we already pushed our thinking forward. So we're hoping to share some of that with you today. We want you to come away from the session today with new clarity about these approaches and the thinking behind them, and also we'll end with some practical tips that can directly strengthen your work, no matter what you're focused on and how you do it. So our format today is going to start with frameworks and definitions from both the trust-based philanthropy and the PGM communities, and then we'll move into a panel discussion with leading thinkers and actors in this work. Now, one thing I want to encourage everyone to do is to have a lens of curiosity and open-mindedness. We are not here to evangelize these approaches as a must do or as right for everyone in every foundation, but we want you to at least learn more and come away with an understanding of how these approaches can help you put your values in action. Finally, I want to name that this is an all funder panel. It was designed intentionally for it to be a funder to funder conversation. But that said, a big part of all of our work is really centering the communities that we work within. And so, in that vein, I would encourage you to check your follow-up email after the session, where we're going to share a lot of links that link you to directly to community voices from our respective organizations. And of course, feel free to share what you're learning. Yelena is going to put our communities and our speakers' Twitter handles in the chat, so feel free to use them liberally with the hashtag #ShiftThePower. That's enough of me talking. Let's find out about you. You're going to see 2 polls pop up on your screen. Let's get a little look at who you are. Yelena, the polls, please. Awesome. So the first question is asking which best describes your organizational affiliation. So tell us who you represent. And then we're asking, is your organization currently exploring or practicing trust-based philanthropy or participatory grantmaking? So I'm going to give a minute for the poll results to come in. And while we're doing that, I love seeing everyone popping up in the chat. Welcome, welcome from Oakland to Mexico City to the UK, from Romania to London, California, and Lenape Land in New York City. Great seeing everyone here. All right, we're going to give 20 more seconds for the poll. And if you're responding other to that first poll question, feel free to stick in the chat what sort of affiliation you have. That would be fun to know. All right. I think we can share the poll results. I don't actually know how to do that. Maybe you do, Yelena. But it looks like we've got a really good mix of people here, with the exception of individual donors, of which we have 0. Maybe there are more individual donors among us than we care to admit, but we've got a lot of foundation folks here, and intermediaries, represent intermediaries. That's what I'm affiliated with. We've got some media, we've got some PSOs here. Thanks, philanthropy serving organizations. We forgot to put that on here, so thanks for saying that in the chat. It's great to have you all here. And then to the second question, it looks like a lot of you are either exploring or practicing both frameworks, which is really exciting. And so in that vein, I want to encourage folks throughout the conversation to put your own experiences in the chat if you'd like. If you have something to add or ideas that you want to share or links you want to share, stick it in the chat. And the chat can also be a very overwhelming place, so feel free to entirely opt out of using the chat as well. I'm going to make sure to download the chat and include it in the follow-up email, so that even if you don't want to look at it during the session, you'll have access to any resources that are shared there. Alrighty, well, I think that's enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Shirdi from the Trust-Based Philanthropy community to give us an overview on what is trust-based philanthropy, why it matters, and what we're going to do with that. Shirdi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, and good day, everyone. My name is Shirdi Salehi. My pronouns are she, her. I am an Iranian woman with shoulder-length brown hair and a side part and gold earrings and pink lipstick on today, which I don't usually wear, so here I am. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and as Jen shared, this conversation is long overdue. We often get a lot of questions about how trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant-making intersect. And at the core, what we're really talking about are really values-led practices in this work. And so we're really excited to dig in and explore those intersections. So I'm here to offer a little bit of a grounding in what trust-based philanthropy is and why. So I'm going to do a little bit of a screen share. and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, on your screen, you see an image of a brick wall that is dividing a funder on one side with a megaphone and nonprofits and community members on the other side with question marks above their head. Ultimately, what this image is here to depict is that there is essentially a values to practice disconnect in traditional philanthropy. So you see this image with the megaphone shouting out, we're committed to reducing barriers, advancing opportunity, and building a healthy, thriving community, which is representative of a lot of the values that drive philanthropic work and philanthropic practice. However, the brick wall really signifies that oftentimes we're out there as funders espousing these values and beliefs. However, the practices that we deploy in our grant making are not necessarily reflective of those values. A lot of that is represented in many of the hoops and constraints and requirements, and all these things get put in the way for nonprofits to actually prove themselves in order to receive funding or be eligible for funding. And what this represents is a fundamental mistrust that exists in the sector, where a lot of our processes and practices lead with a sense of mistrust, wherein nonprofits have to prove themselves and communities have to prove themselves and fit into categories and boxes that have been defined by philanthropy for decades. So not only does this signal an automatic sense of mistrust and distrust that gets in the way of the ability to build authentic relationship with nonprofits and communities, but it also perpetuates significant inequities in our sector. So if you imagine, we place all these barriers and restrictions and requirements in place that are ultimately designed to favor those who know how to navigate this nonprofit ecosystem. So that excludes a lot of community members, excludes a lot of Black and Brown leaders, other marginalized leaders that maybe have less access to the knowledge, the funder networks, all these things that are really essential to accessing funding. And it perpetuates this systemic inequity in the sector. So trust-based philanthropy is ultimately about recognizing that there are inherent power imbalances that exist between funders, nonprofits, and communities, and that we must address those inherent power imbalances if we actually want to get to our end goals and achieve and deliver on the values that we say we stand behind. So the core of what we're talking about with trust-based philanthropy is essentially about redistributing power on a systemic, organizational, and interpersonal level in service of a healthier and more equitable nonprofit ecosystem, and ultimately in service of a more just society. So you often hear about grant-making practices that are associated with trust-based philanthropy, such as multi-year unrestricted giving, streamlined applications and reports. But really the core of all of this is a commitment to building relationships that are based on transparency, dialogue, and mutual learning. It's also important to recognize that trust-based philanthropy is not just about what you do in grant-making practice. A lot of the ways we talk about trust-based philanthropy, what you may have heard or read about this approach, tends to speak to a lot of those grant-making practices, such as multi-year unrestricted funding. Those are core elements of the approach. But if the work is not centered in values of systemic equity, power sharing, relationship, collaboration, then the work really doesn't thrive in a trust-based context. So one common denominator across funders and foundations that are committed to trust-based philanthropy is centering values of power sharing and racial equity and systemic equity in the work that they do. Because if we want to address power and want to work to alleviate power imbalance, we cannot disregard the fact that that power imbalance is there, and that is fundamentally tied to race, gender, ability, all these other factors. So it's important to center those values in not just our grant-making practices, but in how we show up in our org cultures and building a sense of trust internally within our organizations so that we can express trust externally in the work that we do. We have to examine our org structures, our grant agreements, our grant management systems, our hiring policies, all these things that are kind of like the bones of the work that we do. We have to examine those with a values lens. And of course, this is also reliant upon leadership within organizations to uphold and uplift values of equity and power sharing, again, internally and externally, so that we can do that work. So it's a holistic practice that includes grant making practices, but also all these other aspects of an org's work. There's also a set of 6 grant-making practices that are associated with trust-based philanthropy. These are the grant-making expressions of how to extend and express trust with nonprofits and communities. So it includes these practices, many of which are designed to lead with a sense of trust, reinforce a sense of mutual accountability. And we're not talking about unconditional trust. This is actually about practices that enable us to build genuine relationships, create space for listening, dialogue, learning with one another, and also acknowledging that for the work to get done, sometimes it requires unrestricted support over time, simplified processes so that leaders can do the work without extra burdens, and also recognizing that as funders, we provide a lot of opportunities to offer support beyond the check, so that ultimately our work is in partnership in a spirit of service to those who are doing the work on the ground. So this is a very quick overview of what trust-based philanthropy is, but I invite you to listen for these elements, especially the role of trust in recognizing power imbalance and the role of trust in building relationships and community, as you hear from our speakers later today. But I will pass it on to Kelly Buells to Jen to give us a little transition into how this connects to participatory grant making.
Thanks so much, Shirdi. This is Jen. So as Shirdi said, I'm going to be a little bit of an interlude here because for the first time ever, we want to unveil our probably imperfect but still very exciting Venn diagram. And I want to introduce participatory philanthropy. So before I do, just for a brief image description of what you see on the screen, there are 2 circles that intersect. One is yellow and is labeled trust-based philanthropy, and the other is blue and is labeled participatory philanthropy. And the space where they overlap is green. There's a bunch of elements that are listed on top of the circles, and the ones that kind of sit toward the center at the intersection include beyond the check, participatory grant making, community-informed strategy, iteration and learning, community-led boards, and facilitative leadership. So that's the image description, but I want to, since Shirdi talked about trust-based philanthropy, I want to say a couple sentences about participatory philanthropy, which are basically philanthropic approaches that emphasize participation by communities served in various facets of grant-making work. And I guess I would just name that this is all part of a power reckoning that has been happening in our sector for years. There's definitely new attention that's been given to various approaches to philanthropy, and particularly the ones that you see here on the screen that talk about sharing and seeding power. But these also aren't new. These are approaches that have been practiced for a long time, particularly within various communities. But I also want to emphasize that this isn't just about fitting into definitions. So if we can go to the next slide. What this is really about is shared values. So for an image description, you see the same circles here, but now in the green area, that's the overlap between the trust-based philanthropy circle and the participatory philanthropy circle, we see the overlap area is labeled shared values. And the values written here include advancing equity, building relationships, centering community, shift the power, written as a hashtag, and self-reflection. And these are examples of values that are often manifested through a trust-based philanthropy or a participatory philanthropy approach. It's the idea that these values can manifest in any number of ways, but these are often the frameworks that they fall into. So I'm going to pass it over to Kelly, who is part of the working group with the Global Participatory Grantmakers community, to tell us more about how these values manifest in a participatory grant-making environment.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Buells. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white lady with dark brown hair, and I have a black top on today. So I've been a practitioner of participatory grant making for over 10 years now, and I've been working with this community since the participatory grant-making community since its inception in 2020. And so just to give a little bit of an overview of like our shared definitions and values as a community. So the working definition that we use is that participatory grant-making cedes decision-making power about funding, including the strategy and criteria behind those decisions, to the communities that funders aim to serve. And this definition comes out of the 2018 Grantcraft Guide that Jen mentioned earlier, called Deciding Together, which is a great resource for anyone who's new to the topic. And we definitely use the term community broadly in the sense that we've seen this describe both local communities and also global communities. And I'll also just note that we do see it as critical to the work that it's not only the decision-making around grants that's seeded, but also the decision-making around the strategy and the criteria that go into those decisions as well. And so in participatory grant making, the same as in trust-based philanthropy, we really see that the process is the point. It's critical that we embody our shared values in all aspects of this work. So both in the grant making and within our organizations. You can move to the next slide. Thanks. So this community that's formed in the last 2 years, we are a global collective of individuals and organizations, and we're working to share knowledge and practice to improve participatory grant making and encourage its use within philanthropy. So we've been doing this through peer-to-peer learning sessions. We do deeper dives into topics just like this one to share knowledge and to also share like what's working, but also what's not working. And we also advocate in the field of philanthropy to be more transparent, equitable, accountable, and democratic. Next slide. So digging into the community values a little bit, these are the values that we've come up with as a participatory grant-making community. And I just want to name that a lot of practitioners of participatory grant-making, different organizations might center different values or additional values. And so what we tried to do as a community is just name the values that we commonly see and the ones that we feel are critical to the work of participatory grant making. So we believe in self-determination. Self-determination means that people have the right and responsibility to make choices and decisions about their own lives. And this is really like the primary ethos behind participatory grant making, that the people who are being impacted by decisions should be the ones who are making those decisions. We're also rooted in values of anti-oppression and equity. And so we really believe that it's critical to this work to understand histories of discrimination when we're working to ensure equity and inclusion in philanthropy and grant making. And so that really needs to be a key component of a participatory grant making process. We value accountability and transparency. When you're doing the work of ceding power to communities, it's a really hard, it can be a hard process. And so we just want to make space to honor our mistakes. We think it's critical to collect feedback, and we want to hold each other accountable to being stewards of public funds in philanthropy. And lastly, we move with care, love, and joy. And we just find it so important to name this in this work because we believe that the path to liberation must also be liberating. We need to embody our values when we're doing this work, and to bring joy and love into everything that we're doing, so that we can really create a more equitable and just world. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap in terms of values with trust-based philanthropy. And I think I'll also just add that a lot of people who are doing participatory grant making also embed trust-based approaches in that work. And so yeah, that Venn diagram is a really helpful tool.
Well, this is Jen. Thanks so much, Kelly. I really appreciate that breakdown. And Shadi, I want to go back to you for a second because we kind of introduced the shared value piece after you spoke. Do you want to comment on any of the values that were shared or add any to the mix?
Thank you so much, Jen and Kelly. I think one I really want to prioritize here is this overlap around equity, and then particularly from a trust-based philanthropy standpoint, we often emphasize systemic equity. And so what that means is to recognize that our whole sector and all of our practices and everything that has become the norm in philanthropy is rooted in white dominant culture. And that has shaped our assumptions, expectations, regulations, and even like the nitty gritty, like job titles and all those things, which actually come from banking culture. So really recognizing how much that has shaped even notions of what makes an organization or a leader trustworthy or not trustworthy are important things to recognize. And that comes with that self-reflection that Kelly was speaking to, that notion of recognizing that dominant culture exists in our biases and implicit biases that requires a constant self-reflection and a reckoning with how those biases and assumptions are shaping the way we do our work as individuals and also how it shows up in the sector. So that's kind of a constant process that I would say, much like Kelly said, this work is not a checklist. The process is the work, in addition to the stuff that we do externally. So those were a couple things that I would underscore even more.
Fantastic. Thanks for bringing that all in. I want to ask you both a follow-up question, which is about surprises. I think as two communities, we've been relatively separate despite the overlap. And I'm curious just to hear, like, throughout our prep process and also through the presentations now, did anything surprise you or just stand out to you about how the other person spoke about their framework? Kelly, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think the thing that always strikes me is with that Venn diagram, how it doesn't need to be mutually exclusive. I think something that we talked about was how I believe these two approaches could be completely overlapping because I think that the values are so similar. And honestly, I think so many of the practices of trust-based philanthropy show up in the work of participatory grant making. And so, yeah, I loved having conversations about like all of the overlaps and the ways that these approaches align.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. I think that real alignment around shared values is great to see, and I think it also reinforces that if those values are not constantly core to the work, then you can express a distorted version of the practice that actually works against the equity goals and inclusion goals that you may have. So that commonality, it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but it was really reaffirming to know that, these are very complementary approaches that, yes, can overlap fully when you lead from a place of values, because otherwise, you can do the practices. You can say, okay, we have a participatory grant committee and okay, we're doing the multi-year unrestricted funding. But if the values are not driving the decision-making and all the work, you could actually perpetuate harm. So I hope some of our speakers will get into that, but I think this is not like a, supposed to be like a big, wagging a finger at you, but it is an important reminder that it's not just about what you do in practice, it's about the internal work that's required in order to fully embody the values.
Yeah, these are great reflections, and I'll share one that I was having as you were both speaking, which I think we'll get into a little on the panel too, which is that these different but aligned approaches also create accountability for each other. So for those taking a trust-based approach, I think thinking about how participation can be a mechanism for holding a trust-based approach accountable is really powerful. And similarly, if you're taking a participatory approach, how is trust showing up in that work? And I think we'll get to explore that a little bit more, but that was just a reflection that I had around accountability. I've got one more question for you both, and those who know me won't be surprised by this, but I don't think we sit in meaningful tension enough in philanthropy or in the world, but that's another webinar. Both of these approaches to philanthropy are really great, but sometimes they might sit in tension. So I'm curious, are there any tensions that are surfacing for you that you want to name for us just to sit within the conversation, not to resolve, not to go into, but just to name and have us sit with while we move into the panel?
One tension I've heard from other colleagues in the field is that, sometimes in a participatory framework, when people who have been in nonprofit roles are invited in to make decisions about grant making, there is a sense of kind of internalized oppression that some leaders bring into the work. So if you have been in the nonprofit world and have experienced the harms and the restrictions of philanthropy, sometimes there can be a tendency to want to perpetuate those very practices in the decision-making process. So that's one tension that has emerged, where bringing in people who have experienced this and have sensed that this is kind of the way to do it might actually perpetuate some of those practices, which can perpetuate distrust and potential harm. So there is a bit of an unlearning that needs to be done by many of us who have internalized these practices and expectations that have been the norm, in order to kind of, embody and express a different way of doing the work.
Great. Kelly, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just building on that, because I think I was going in a similar direction, but I almost think the tension is like with philanthropy and like understanding gift money and like how gift money flows, because I think so many of the practices and structures that are set up come out of like traditional finance and capitalism and white supremacy culture. And when you look at the history of like how gift money behaves in an economy and like how indigenous communities have been working with this for so long, I think it's really just that tension of like we don't need to be gatekeepers, we don't need to be doing any of these things. And so yeah, it's like doing that inner work of letting all of that go and being open to a completely different type of process.
Kelly, Shadi, thank you both for brilliant perspectives. I'm going to invite our panelists to metaphorically join me, which I think just means spotlighting them. And while they're getting spotlighted, I also want to invite folks in the audience to share any reflections or tensions that you're sitting with in the chat. We won't probably verbally talk about them right now, but it's a nice way to kind of document other perspectives. And again, we'll include the chat transcript in a follow-up email. And lo and behold, the panelists have arrived. Thank you, Han, Pamela, Lisa, for being here today. We are so excited to hear about your experiences. And I want to just start with brief intros for each of you. So I'm going to ask you just to briefly introduce yourself. And the same as we asked our audience in the poll question, I want to just ask each of you to give us like a quick 30 seconds on, is your foundation practicing trust-based philanthropy, participatory grant making, both, neither, or maybe you're not totally sure. So Han, I'm going to start with you, and then Pamela, and then Lisa.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. Apologies, my voice is coming in and out, so please bear with me. My name is Han Lee. I use she, her pronouns. I am an Asian American woman with long black hair, wearing a pink blouse. And our foundation, if a foundation for radical possibility, is practicing both trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making.
Hello, everyone. Go ahead, Jen. Okay.
I was just saying, over to you.
Okay. My name is Pamela Ross. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a Black woman with newly blonde hair and a black sleeveless dress to gather the heat of Houston, Texas. And I work for the Indianapolis Foundation. I think that was, and so for us, that's kind of a, I don't know, I think we're somewhere in between of both.
Excellent. And you're getting a Houston shout out in the chat. Lisa, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Small. I serve as the Deputy Director of Youth and Transformative Justice at the Liberty Hill Foundation. We are a foundation that for over 40 years has used community review boards and community-centered practices to do both trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making. I will say not always perfectly, not always without its challenges, and we're always iterating and making mistakes and trying to figure out what those look like. And so just so appreciate this conversation about the intersection of each of these practices and sometimes the messy and imperfect way that we interact with these ideals. So we're always continuing to do that work. I am a white woman with auburn hair, a black t-shirt or turtleneck, and I'm located in Southern California in Los Angeles. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks to everyone. And I just want to also acknowledge, I see great questions coming in the chat. We're going to note them and include a few of them in a Q&A section. So keep them coming. We're going to hit a few other things first, and then we'll come back to it. So as an opening question for all of you, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how your organization is really leveraging participatory grant making as a means of shifting power. And I'd love to hear you also comment on if and how trust plays a role in that. And I think for this round, we'll just go in the reverse order that we just did our intros in. So Lisa, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Jen. So yeah, I wanted to talk today a little bit about Liberty Hill does so many things. We're a grant maker, we're a fundraiser, we're a capacity builder. So we wear many different hats. And part of my role at the foundation is I'm the director of a program called Ready to Rise. It's a collaboration between two foundations, the Liberty Hill Foundation, which I represent, and the California Community Foundation. And this was really a partnership we launched with the LA County Probation Department, in which we acted as an intermediary organization, or we call it a third-party administrator, where we help to receive grant dollars from the LA County Probation Department and re-grant it to community-based youth development providers. Liberty Hill really provided capacity building, and we worked in conjunction with our colleagues to do grant making as well. And so what we had heard for a very long time was that folks in the community could not access public dollars from the probation department. They felt like the process was racist and antiquated, and really just they didn't have the capacity to access public dollars based on their own responsiveness to the crisis of every day, and not being able to reply to 100+ page RFP with a full-time person and giving all of their capacity. And so we said, as two foundations, we would work together. We would serve as that direct contracted agency with probation, and then we would re-grant those dollars to the community. And what we really found was that because folks had been locked out of this system, we really did not want to replicate those practices in our own grant making capacity building. So we really focused on, first and foremost, developing trust between our two foundations. We had really different cultures and ways of communicating and ways of practicing that we didn't want to pass on to our grantees. And so we worked really hard behind the scenes to square those circles and to make sure that we were speaking with one voice and that we were aligned so that grantees didn't have to deal with those conflicts on the back end. We created a singular email, we created a singular newsletter that we really spoke from this Ready to Rise mantle instead of, two disparate foundations. We developed community review boards so that every application and every interview was conducted by community members as well as folks from both of our foundations. And we made sure that we really led a participatory evaluation process. So we hired folks that were embedded in the community for 30+ years. They taught our organizations how to do their own youth focus groups. They designed responsive evaluation practices with each organization so that they were customized and responsive. And we just really, at every step in the way, made sure that we were asking folks what they needed and tried to respond to that. So even before we launched an application, we surveyed the entire youth development field and said, what do you want to see in an RFP? What do you need from us in terms of capacity building? And then we built even the application and review process with those responses in mind. So we really tried to act, 180 degrees from what we had heard folks saying was their experience working with a county agency. And, it wasn't perfect by any means, but we really leaned very heavily into this participatory experience that in itself required an immense amount of trust between all of the parties involved.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful example. And there's a lot we could pull out of that to underscore, but I want to underscore how participation can happen at every stage of a program. It doesn't just have to happen in the back end implementation of a program, like after a design phase. It can happen from day one. And I think your example was really strong in showing that. Pamela, let's go to you next.
So with the Indianapolis Foundation, we're one of the oldest community foundations in the country. I think the first one was the Cleveland Foundation. So we were founded in 1916. So for 105, well now 105, but for like 103 years at the point of which we realized we needed to be a different community foundation in the essence of what we were seeing and hearing regarding the data. And one of the biggest things also that in the data, where it's right in our community, the economic mobility of people in certain geographic areas, and I'm sure that that's not new to people, most people on the screen, in your own communities, the gap was growing. It was not getting any, was not decreasing any, in spite of how many millions of dollars have been poured into the community. So it became, what is our role now? And one of the things in creating our new strategic plan, we realized we were not talking enough to residents. We were not hearing directly from residents. We were getting our information, our data from the reports that we would get from the grant making. So we decided in the essence of creating our new strategic plan that we needed to engage residents directly. The short of it is, I always say we didn't find out any new data. What we found is, as a foundation, we need to have a very clear avenue of how to hear from residents directly. So in 2017, that was community ambassador report of 37 individuals that engaged. My first responsibility as the VP of Opportunity, Equity, and Inclusion in 2018 was to pull together an ambassador program. These individuals, we have 8. They represent different geographic locations as well as different populations. And when I came to the table with them, they did not know me. All of them did not know each other. And so in short, it was like, we had to get to the work. So thinking about you, Shirdi, and just saying the process is the work. And so that was the first thing is to get into relationship. And what does that mean to get into relationship? As an institution who has deadlines, who sees things from, let's create a framework, here's by now, 6 months later, let's start having teams that go into the community, and who's leading that conversation. And so for me, it was, I have no agenda. I'm here when all of you are here. You create what the agenda will be. I will listen, I will take it back. And the friction, or as you called it, Jen, the tension, that would be my first example of that. Because the expectations of what that was supposed to look like from the first engagement with residents was, we did create an agenda, but we didn't realize that. We asked them questions, they wouldn't ask it. But this time when we came back together, there was no agenda. And so how do you explain that to your institutions when it's like some work that is absolutely work, but because it's the process, how do you measure that? How do you go and say, like, work is really happening? So now it's been 4 years, and I can talk more about what fruits, what has manifest from that. But it was definitely, how do you shift the power? How do you share the power? And how do you make sure that as an institution, you're just showing up to learn so that you can actually create that trust? There's an extreme trusting. There's a lot of trust at that table now amongst each of them, as well as with me. And at the same time, then I become the liaison or that space to how do I make sure that the trust in the institution is also pushed forward. But a lot has happened in our work with community ambassadors, including the community really seeing that they also do have power. So how do you manage that? That their power is really within who they are as residents, not necessarily because they are Indianapolis Foundation ambassadors. So it's been a very interesting, but that would be the main, in the short run of the last 4 years, that we started to directly engage with residents and not go into how do we find out what's happening with residents through the not-for-profit organizations that we fund. The one other thing I forgot to mention, Jen, is that when we did make our shift, we also changed our mission after over 100 years. And so the mission became it made things more clear about what we are supposed to be doing from that internal as well as external. And our mission became that, we want to see everyone in Central Indiana have an opportunity to reach their fullest potential, and no matter place, race, or identity. And so we put a very strong stake in the ground before the recent racial reckoning, that we were not going to hide from the fact that race plays a strong role in the systems and in the inequities that we see. So it's been a lot.
That's really powerful, though. Thanks for sharing that. And I want to underscore what you said. You said, I went in without an agenda when you were talking about starting to build a relationship. And one thing I would encourage folks to listen for is that people doing this work really emphasize showing up in their full humanity, like showing up as the humans behind the foundation. And I think when we think of agendas, it automatically becomes like a work process. And agendas serve a really good function. I'm all for effective meetings, but sometimes you can't dive right into a really active agenda, maybe a design process, until you've spent unstructured time getting to know each other. So I just want to really appreciate that and everything else you said. We're going to come back to the comments on not ignoring race in a little bit, but first, Han, I want to go over to you to hear your thoughts.
Or so if it's been around for about 30 years, but really on a 10-year journey to center community in how we do philanthropy. So we released a new strategic plan last year. To really become, in our evolution from a health conversion, health equity foundation to a squarely racial justice foundation that is working to advance a vision where Black people and people of the global majority can live beautifully, abundantly, powerfully in healthy, self-determined communities, right? Free of ecological, sociological, and ideological violence. And so we have 5 pillars we think we need to advance as a foundation to advance racial justice. And those are around culture and narrative, healing justice, institutions and structures, reparations and economic justice, and community power. And when we say community, we mean that those who are living at the sharpest intersections of systems of oppression, namely race, class, and gender identity. And so currently, after many years, we have 4 community members on our board, and more than 75% of our grant making is decided on by a community grant making committee. And we work really hard to build an intentional inclusivity in how and with whom we engage to facilitate participation and trust building. So, looking at diversity across race, gender, sexual identity, making sure that we're tending to language justice so that people can lift up their voice, right? And access power in that way and demonstrate power in that way, making sure that how we're engaging with community is in partnership and not extractive. So ensuring that we're providing fair honoraria, childcare, transportation, getting materials to people in a way that works for them. And trust is really baked in throughout kind of what we do and how we do it. We trust in community to know best what it needs, and we work hard to earn and maintain trust in us as a foundation through transparency and accountability.
Han, that's fantastic. And I want to ask you a follow-up question as we dig into more conversation here. So it sounds like you're doing a lot with trust, but of course there are tensions that arise with that. So what tensions have you experienced as you've embedded more trust-based practices within this predominantly participatory grant making approach?
Yeah, and I will lift up, kind of build on what Shadi said earlier in her opening. Like, I think a lot of this um, participatory grant making at the intersection and combined with trust-based philanthropy is about decolonizing ourselves and, you know, decolonizing philanthropy. So the nonprofit industrial complex and systemic racism have taught us a lot of fallacies, right? Like that there's not enough, that only certain people have the knowledge and expertise and deservedness to decide where money goes and how to manage money, and that grant processes need to be onerous, right? I remember when I first started doing grant making many years ago, I created this process that was totally reflective of what I experienced as a grant seeker. Um, and didn't stop to say, like, why are we asking all these questions or doing all this? So it's really baked into us. So I think we need to disrupt these practices and narratives in ourselves and with our community partners so we don't replicate them. And at the same time, as funders, we really need to think about how do we do this in a way that is not patronizing, right? And saying like, well, we've been studying trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making, we know best, and we're gonna teach you. So I think one of the tools that we use is popular education, right? Popular political education, so that where we're recognizing that everyone has knowledge and experience and expertise to share, to gain and to teach. And so that we're learning as a community together is one of the ways that we're kind of addressing some of those tensions.
That's great. And Lisa, I want to ask you the same question, but sort of in reverse, since you've always had trust at the center and you're trying to like move more toward participatory grant making. So have you bumped into any challenges as you've tried to do that, tried to advance your trust through participatory grant making?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an example that we found through our work with the California Funders for Boys and Men of Color. This was a collective of organizations that Liberty Hill pledged to raise $5 million for 7 organizations and 2 coalitions to advance a blueprint that they created to end youth incarceration in Los Angeles County as we know it. And in its place, really stand up the first ever comprehensive department for advancing youth development in LA County. And so we said to them, we don't want you to be worrying about fundraising. We want you to be thinking about advancing this plan for justice. And so we'll raise funds on your behalf. And you can focus on the work. And so we brought folks together in these coalitions, in these organizations that honestly had never worked together before. A lot of them had worked adjacent to each other. And to Han's earlier comments, a lot of them had been in competition with one another. So there wasn't immense trust in the room because of that scarcity mentality of we've always been pitted against one another. And so we're always, working in opposition to do the same type of impact in our community. And so we said, we're going to bring you together to work in coalition space. And so a lot of trust, making had to be done in that space to get folks to really be able to relax into that process. And so once it happened that we raised the money, then it really came down to, well, how are we going to distribute it? And so initially it became an individual relationship with each organization and our foundation where folks told us what they need and what they were doing. And we made calculations based on how we would fund them. And then as the work evolved, we really realized this needs to be a much more participatory process. We want folks to come together and define how they want this money to be split up amongst these coalitions and organizations themselves. And so we came to them, we had a proposal for a design process in which, they could develop the proposal process, they could review each other's applications, like there would be presentations, we developed this entire process that we felt was incredibly participatory. And we brought it to them and said, what do you think? And they said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to review each other's proposals. We've worked for years to develop trust amongst us. We finally feel like we're really at that place where trust has been developed and solidified. We don't want to begin the process of backsliding by deciding that we deserve more or they deserve less. And so they came to us and said, we really want this money to be split equally amongst the 7 organizations, and we want a different percentage of the money to go to the coalition, with which each of the organizations were members of at least one or both of the coalitions. And so they just told us, And so what we really learned from that process was trust really was at the center, in order to say what is participatory for us is actually you just being responsive to our needs. And we listened, we did what they had asked. And, you know, last Thanksgiving, we saw the blueprint advance, and the first county department for youth development was mandated by the Board of Supervisors, and they were able to succeed in those goals. July 1st, that department will launch and open its doors for the first time, where young people in LA County will be able to access youth development without having to first be arrested or incarcerated, which is really unbelievable that that's happening for the first time in 2022 in the county across the nation that incarcerates more young people than anywhere else on planet Earth.
Wow. First of all, congratulations. Super excited to hear that outcome and progress. I really love that. And something that's really striking me is just about your extreme flexibility as a foundation. I think a lot of foundations, when they decide to embark on some sort of pilot, like they've pitched their board, they've pitched their staff, they've pitched other stakeholders on this new participatory grant making experiment. And I think one of the biggest fears is failure, or not having it go the way that they think it's going to go. And I love your story because it didn't go how you thought it might go. It actually went a very different direction, but with a great outcome. And ultimately, it was still this values-driven approach where you centered the community, you trusted the community, and you followed their lead. So I just want to underscore that for folks, that like, it's okay for things not to go as planned. It's okay for things not to fit perfect definitions or models, because that's not really doing the work, like forcing things into boxes. Doing the work really means listening to and centering the voice of the communities that you've brought to the table. So I think that example illustrates that really well. So Pamela, I want to move over to you and ask, like, what opportunities are you seeing as a result of the Community Ambassadors program that you mentioned before? And what do you feel is like particularly relevant to the community foundation context?
So maybe I'll start with your latter part of your question. We, in the essence of, having already pivoted our values and the need to build authentic relationships with residents, when the pandemic hit, we were already ready to hit the go button, because we had already created those relationships with them to give them directly, put money into their hands to make decisions about how their neighbors were supported, whether or not that was transportation, that was food, that was medicine, whatever that was. And on both sides, that became really a critical point in trust. Like, we trust you to make the decisions, because they were still saying, there was questions like, well, how much can they spend on groceries? And the pushback again would be, how much do they tell you they need for groceries? You make the decisions based off of the trust and the relationships you have built. You are now you hold the cards to make decisions. We are providing the support. And within that, we just carried it on into the rental assistance. Marion County was number 2, I think maybe still is, in the country regarding evictions. And so when the rental assistance program, or the federal government offered, and I haven't stopped keeping up if they're still being offered or not, but when that process was rolled out, it was very bureaucratically heavy. So the city turned to the ambassadors to inform them on how they could do it differently. The short of it is, one of the deputy mayors over those funds continued to come back to the table with these individuals to understand where the policies were too bureaucratic. But not only that, they decided to also do something differently and actually create a fund of which these ambassadors made the same type of decisions. There was a process that was created, but it didn't ask for, your mother's, birth certificate or whatever. It did not make it so strenuous that people who really needed rental assistance, especially in light of our eviction rate in the country, were going to have to go through further hoops. And then guess what? It worked. You got exactly what you needed, the baseline of what you needed. And one of the questions that was asked in their process what brings you joy. So in that, you're also recognizing people as human beings. And then they use that to then go back and understand how they continue to connect with them. So millions of dollars were leveraged, whether it was informing the current system, as well as money actually going into a fund of which the ambassadors were able to make decisions. They are now in a place where really they're community consultants. You know, everybody wants to tap in now to the voice of the community. If we want consultants to come and help us in our institutions, we pay them. And we don't pay them a little bit. We don't call it stipends. We pay them. They're contractors, they're consultants. The type of information that these individuals bring to institutions who really want it, you need to pay for it. You have to pay for it. And we have always paid the ambassadors, but what has also been leveraged is their level of expertise about the things that institutions want to know. So you're not having focus groups, you don't have these surveys. You actually see them as equal professionals in trying to create a more equitable community. And so you have to pay for that. That has been a huge amount of leveraging that I could talk, more about. But in the essence of the work itself, one of the biggest things I think is for us to know, and Han, you touched on this, but it's like this work is messy. This is not your typical institutional work. The work requires you to go outside of your boundaries, to think differently, and to really have to sometimes have the hard conversations, whether it's with leadership, your board, some of the partners in the community that you believe have been your strongest partners. When you pivot like this, you have to be prepared for some of the things that are not our typical philosophical way of how we think we're going to resolve issues. And money is not going to be the determining factor of how these challenges that we're trying to tackle together, money is not going to be the primary factor. It's going to be the relationships. So until you really get a hold on the relationships internally and externally, you continue to be more like a hamster on a wheel. And I think that is probably that is the biggest thing, because as institutions, part of the unlearning is just not the way we think, but also, of course, the way we operate, and which means we also need to slow down, and we also need to make different decisions. And we're afraid to make the different decisions because we're afraid of what may happen on the other side. But if you think about the fact that we've been spending millions of dollars, we have expended millions of dollars into problems that have not gone away, you would find yourself being compelled to say we should do it differently. Because I'll say it here amongst 200 people, but the fact of the matter is that if we're worried about wasting money, then we could say we've already wasted some money.
We've wasted a lot of money. And I'm excited by efforts like these that are, doing less waste and doing more good. And I kind of want to ask you a follow-up question, because I think one of the places I've seen a lot of waste in the field is on initiatives that claim to be about racial equity, but it's really more of a PR thing for foundations. And so I'm curious, Pamela, and anyone else who has any quick thought, do you see participatory grant making and trust-based approaches as a means to advancing racial equity? Can it do that?
Yes, I believe definitely. But again, it can. That's the answer. Yes, it can, but it has to be in the integrity and in the values of the organization, and who in power. What power is pushing you to not operate in that integrity, in that transparency, in that vulnerability to say, we have to do it differently because right now it's a shiny penny, but we have to do it differently because if you really do care about your community and the people in your community, then you understand that you have not been getting it all right. Doesn't mean we've been getting it all wrong, but when you sit in the seats of power that we have, we typically, funders are the ones that say this is the right way, and we make everyone else then level up to that. But we don't know enough. So I think we can absolutely get to the real authentic place, especially around race and equity and systemic racism, because it is planted in the systems. That's how philanthropy is where we sit right now. So until you can have those real truthful conversations, then no, you cannot do it. But if you want to be in that place of really truthful conversations and really digging in, then yes, we can. Just not sure how many want to go deep into that path because it's deep.
It's deep, it's really important, and it's certainly not for everyone, but it would be nice to see more foundations doing that depth of work with more intention. So thanks for sharing that. And Han, I want to go over to you. Have you seen any unanticipated outcomes as a result of your work building trust with community members? I think sometimes we go in with one expectation of what it's going to do, and we notice a whole slew of other things. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think when, as part of our community center transformation a few years ago now, we started wanting to teach community members, right? Taxi drivers, people who make your sandwiches, right? Those living at these sharpest intersections of oppression about philanthropy. Even some of my friends don't really understand what philanthropy is, right? And much less people who have felt disempowered to understand and learn about philanthropy. And so we did a series called Foundation Learning Days, and got great participation in that. And one of the people who participated in that program was this woman named Veronica Tucker, or V. And V was really just impressed by this idea that private foundations have endowments, and that we invest those endowments, and that we kind of just let those endowments sit and we live off the interest of those endowments. It really stuck with her. And V is a hospitality worker who lost her job in COVID, right? So fast forward to COVID. She lost her job. She's been organizing her whole life as a worker, and was trying to do a GoFundMe campaign to raise cash dollars for other displaced hospitality workers, and came to our then president and CEO, Yannick Redwood, and said, if we can raise a good chunk of money, can IF invest that money for us? And then we have more money to give out as cash, right? One, like the trust and relationship that she had built with IF and our president and CEO, to feel like she could come to us with this idea and this request saying, this is what the community needs. We have an idea. What do you think? What can you do? And we've worked with V, and we've run with it. And just today, I'll put a link in the chat. We've launched a 5-year guaranteed income initiative that is worker driven, based on V's idea, right? That's providing $1,000 a month for 5 years to displaced hospitality workers from COVID. And that's going to be funded by an innovative impact investing model, where foundations are actually raising that money for an impact investment, going to take that interest earned from that investment and use it to fund guaranteed income for the next 5 years. And then advocate for systems change for guaranteed income policies and programs. So that is based on the trust building work that we've done, the bringing community into philanthropy work that we've done, and now it's created a program that we could not have imagined ourselves, but that we can now leverage kind of all the philanthropic assets and knowledge and connections at our disposal to make a reality.
Thanks, Han. That's a really great example. Lisa, I want to come over to you, and maybe following on a little bit from the question I just asked Han. I think there's a lot that we learn in the process of doing this work, and I think iteration is really a huge part of working within these models. Part of iterating really means doing a lot of intentional listening and learning. And we're not talking about the type of listening where folks go out and like ask questions and then don't do anything with it, or they don't loop back to communities, but like deep listening that feeds back into and informs the work. So I'm curious, like at Liberty Hill, like what have you learned and what'd you do with the learning?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I hope you all can hear me, because I am getting notices that my internet is a bit unstable. So definitely chat me if you can't hear me well. But what I will say is that we definitely have done a lot of iterating, a lot of listening. And
Oh, this is Jen. Now you're frozen. We'll give her 1 second to see if she reemerges, and otherwise, Pamela, the question's coming over to you. Let's do that. Pamela, over to you, and then we'll see if Lisa comes back with us and let her finish. So the question again is about iteration. What have you learned? What'd you do with that?
So I probably have said, I wrote it down and I think I answered it before I should have or was ready for the answer. But it's just, I think the biggest thing we learned, like tomorrow we're hosting for the second time a meeting just around organizing. And the very first time we did it, we hosted it and I kind of led it, and it got real messy real fast. And it was like one of those things again, like, this is not your place, and I understood that, but it's like, as a funder, I feel like we have a responsibility to support the organizing space, because if we're really saying that we support power within the community and shifting of the power, then how do we support more of that happening? And so when I think about tomorrow, and right now with you all, I get angst. The truth of the matter is, because that's not a space that we can monitor and navigate. I mean, it needs to be, respectful, but the conversations are really heightened. People are very hurt, kind of like what Lisa mentioned earlier. They're very hurt. And so that's my very short way of I'm just going to stick with the fact, when you really get into the work and you really want to bring the community in, and where the two sides shall meet as far as institution and residents, it is messy. It's not a bad messy, but it's not the kind that we are used to managing, one, because you don't get to manage the space, you only get to be a part of it. And it's not the kind that says, okay, and here's the timeline or here's the deadline. And the expectations when you step into this arena are so much higher than when you never make a claim that you will. So it's like, you can't say this is what you're going to do and then do the same thing, because the community will then come after you for that too, rightfully so. So, I mean, those are just, it's like when you hear it, when we hear something, whatever it is, and we've heard a lot, we need to sit with it, and then we need to decide how we can act on it in the most authentic way and be very truthful. If it's really something that we see we're not going to be able to do, then we need to name that too. We need to say it. Otherwise, you just keep doing the same with different language.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Pamela. And I think one thing I'm hearing in what you're saying is that you can actually break down trust by not listening and responding. And that's a tension to hold too, because what happens when you continually listen but keep doing what you're doing? Well, you're actually pushing people away. So thanks for raising that point. Lisa, I want to go back to you. You're moving, you look normal and back. So I'm going to come back to you briefly to weigh in on this one.
Thank you, and my apologies for my internet connection today. Of course, this is the day. But yeah, I just wanted to double down on what I heard Pamela saying, which yes, it really is for me about relationship power above all else and about being responsive. So for us, iterating has always meant not just about being trust-based and not just about being participatory, but really about being responsive and listening. And I think that those things can dovetail into those other practices, but it can sometimes mean that you have to shift and you have to really be nimble in the process. I will also say that for us, capacity building has just been a really essential piece of the puzzle, that having those coaching relationships, having those training spaces, the workshop spaces, it allows people to show up with vulnerability to the larger process of grant making and exchanging funds. And so that really, for me, is an essential piece of the trust-based part of it all, is that when you're allowing people to come to the table and say, we need help on these things, we need more capacity, we need you to work alongside of us in areas where we're not perfect and we're not just showing you the shiny penny side of us, it then allows so much more trust-based principles to arise and kind of forwards that process that I really heard so many people talking about today, which is based on deep and long-standing relationships above all.
Terrific. Thanks, Lisa. I'm glad you're back with us. I was also having internet issues earlier today, so it's just what we all deal with in these work from home environments. I want to make sure we get to a bunch of the good questions that are being asked in the chat. So for these, I'm just going to direct them to one person. I'm sure you could all answer all of them, but I want to get to as many as possible. But of course, feel free to jump in if anyone has something burning to say, and I flagged it for someone else. Han, I'm gonna flag this first question for you, and it's one that got many +1s early on in the chat. So just to read directly, I get the impression that both PGM and trust-based philanthropy are hot right now in philanthropy, and there's pressure for organizations to adopt them who might not be ready from a values and power analysis perspective. Curious if that's what you're seeing and how conversations with folks who are keen to adopt them are going.
I think something that we saw, especially during COVID, and the need for philanthropy to be super responsive, right, to the crises happening in our communities, is that particularly with trust-based philanthropy, there was just people were doing it because they felt that they need to get money out the door as quickly as possible. And the concern is that would philanthropy go back to doing things the way that we had been before? And I think some of that is the case, right? That was kind of like philanthropy in crisis mode, but not really changing its practices. But I do think it lifted up the possibility for a lot of funders to see that, oh, we don't need to have these onerous, like non-trust-based approaches to our work. Like, we are able to get money out the door quickly without a lot of hoops and in a way that the community most needs. And so I think there's an opportunity there for people to really, maybe for staff of foundations, to make the case to their boards that there is a different way, and we're able to do it, and we can make that a part of who we are and how we operate, and not just kind of in crisis response mode. I think in regard to participatory grant making, I think there's more and more of a call for centering community in the work of hiring. I appreciate this framing that you presented, Jen, around participatory philanthropy, not just participatory grant making, right? That it's all of the things that you as a foundation or a giving entity can do to center community in the work, and therefore the value that comes out of that in building community power and actually advancing your mission. And so I think where there's been a disconnect is between, what is it called? Brene Brown just taught me this, behavioral, a gap between values and behavior. But I think this is an opportunity for us to really, in philanthropy, to examine like what our stated values are and how our behaviors in all levels and all dimensions of our organization are aligning with them. I think a lot of foundations committed to social justice would see that trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making are definitely aligned with values. So what needs to happen for that to be truly embodied, I think, is the important next step.
Thanks, Han. Lisa, next, a question for you. How do you make the case for these approaches to leadership at organizations, including both staff and boards? What tips do you have?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest with you, I'm in a very lucky and unique situation where we don't have to do a lot of convincing to leadership. These values are so embedded in what we do and how we do it that when we're in the practicing part of the work, we're not seeing a lot of CEO intervention or board intervention that says, please stop, we don't get it. It's been really baked in. So I guess that would be my real recommendation, is start with the values principles first, and not to just introduce these concepts in a pilot phase, but really to kind of work from the front end to embed the principles of community and trust and participation kind of from the front end of how a foundation interacts with the community to begin with, how you can bring racial equity into everything you're doing so that it doesn't become a one-off here or a one-off there.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Pamela, over to you with a question. So someone asked, how do you avoid perpetuating harm when you're doing capacity building work, which philanthropy has historically used to perpetuate power imbalances, like we see it all the time. So how do you do as little harm or no harm as possible?
Well, one, we start referring to it differently. Instead of capacity building, is infrastructure development. And moving from the fact that there's something that's missing to there's something that's there and just needs to be built. And so in that, we really, again, we try to take a back seat to what does the community, which also includes in our work, in our grant making, also includes entities that do not have 501c3s. To us, that is also systemic, that you're forced into having a 501c3 in order to get resources. So what does it mean to be a fiscal sponsor? What does that mean to us to support that? So getting beyond the grant making to actually being a partner in the community, which means we sit down, we listen, and then again, we act. And so we are listening, and we are also framing the work that happens within the infrastructure development within a culturally competent and very relevant space of, if you are a BIPOC individual in this space, the way that you have to operate, the experiences that you have are not the same as some of our typical ways of offering services to the community to help them build their infrastructure. So it's the same principle, is that you sit down and you actually hear what is being said. The other thing I think significant that I will bring to it is we are again leaning into that there are consultants, there are people who are very knowledgeable and can actually help support each other in the community. We don't need to bring in outside consultants who have been deemed to be the best in the field, understand everything about everything, to become this greatest 501c3 or this great not-for-profit. Because not everybody wants to scale. So that's another essence of agency. Do you want to scale? Some are we just want to do the work. We just need the support, but we're not trying to be everything that you want us to be. So it is very much about agency. It's the autonomy. What is yours? What is it that you see for the work that you do, and how do we support it?
Thanks for that. And I'll add one small example from my neck of the woods too. At Disability Rights Fund, we started a new learning exchange model that actually puts grantees in touch with each other to learn from each other, with the same idea that knowledge exists within communities. We don't need outside experts to build capacities that already exist. And I think that really allows the learning to be led by and for our grantees without any intervening people or agendas. So I just wanted to layer that in. And Shirdi, thanks for letting me tag you in by way of adding you to a spotlight. There was one question that came in that I thought would be good for you to speak to, which is, what are the trends toward these approaches? Is the shift happening? Are we seeing more funders moving in this direction? And is there data?
I wish we had some amazing quantitative data. I know there is a lot of data collection that is happening, so there will be things that will be coming out likely over the next year or so. So keep an eye out. But I will say anecdotally and quantitatively, I think we have seen a growth in interest in these practices. I mean, both the trust-based philanthropy peer exchange and the participatory grant-making community have grown into the hundreds. These are all practitioners that are actively working on shifting their practices. As many of you may know, when the pandemic hit, the Council on Foundations put out a pledge inviting foundations around the world to adopt and shift their practices in light of the crisis. 800 plus foundations signed that pledge, meaning that they committed to making changes during the pandemic. First of all, I want to mention the pandemic is not over, so holding on to those practices is something that would be a worthy effort. But also because the likelihood that we will experience more crises, and the current crises that we're living within will continue on. So more and more funders are beginning to recognize the value of reducing those barriers, building opportunity to build relationship with nonprofits and communities, the learnings that are coming out of that. There have been a series of light bulb moments that have occurred. And for those of us who've been in this sector, there have been many leaders who've been talking about the needs for these changes for quite a while. And the convergence and the shift that's happening now is pretty unprecedented. So I think our work, for those of us who are committed to this work, is to make the case that this is not a disaster response strategy or a tactical strategy. This is actually about shifting the paradigm if we truly want to get to our end goals. So the movement is growing. You'll get some input about you'll get some links to sign and join the movement. And I'll also share that, you know, as people shift practices, it is opening the door for doing some of that deeper reckoning around white supremacy culture and power reckoning that is essential to this work. So the change is happening, but I do say it's upon all of us who do the work, who see the benefits of it, both for the funder side and for the community and nonprofit side, to continue to push that conversation forward and continue to talk about it and talk about those benefits, because the more we do this collective learning work out loud, the more we can invite our peers to engage in this work.
Thanks so much, Shadi. Really appreciate that. I want to actually move into a closing question for all of our panelists. It's getting to be that time, and I like to end with a concrete piece of advice for everyone who's here so that they can walk away with something concrete. So the question I want to ask you all is, what's a piece of advice that you'd offer to those listening today who want to take steps to explore participatory grant making at the intersection of trust-based philanthropy? And feel free, you know, I think there are folks in our audience who are exploring these approaches, but also folks who are there who are in constant iteration mode. So feel free to kind of speak to either of those groups. And for folks who are sitting there listening, I want to encourage you to grab a piece of paper or a digital piece of paper and actually write down one or more things that the panelists are going to share now, or something else that stood out to you over the course of this discussion, because it's so easy to leave sessions like this and go back to your inbox or go into another meeting and sort of let it slip away. But write something down that you can maybe hold yourself accountable to thinking more about and following up on. So for this closing question, we'll keep it super short, 30 seconds from each of you, one actionable thing. Han, let's start with you.
I hope this is concrete enough, but I just really want to underline that we need to make centering community and trust in our work not just a component of what we do programmatically, but an integral part of who we are as reflected in our values and behavior in all parts of our organizations and at all levels of the organization.
Great. Thanks, Han. Pamela, to you.
I guess I would probably, first of all, plus one what Han said, but I would also say that, again, when you think about people in your sphere who you most respect and you most care about and who you most believe in, assess your seat every day around how are you building those values and how you operate. We have to self-assess. Because that's the only way that we will keep on navigating our way through this, is that it comes out of our head and goes into our hearts and the seats that we own. So it's difficult to do, but when you feel like, am I really doing this right? Or am I getting off track? Look at someone that you really do. Think about someone you really care about to center yourself again, because there's too much that's going on in institutions that can take you off track.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's as simple, my advice is as simple as pay folks for their participation. You know, don't expect folks to show up and do the work of participatory practices without recognizing that it takes a lot of capacity, a lot of time. And often we rely on voices of community, of young people, who are not paid to do the work. You know, we all show up to this meeting, and I think most of us are probably paid to sit in the seats that we are in today, but not everybody is. And so I loved what Pamela said earlier. We always make sure that if we're paying experts, we're paying our grantees themselves to be experts for each other, to show up and to show out and to be part of these processes.
Oh, thank you all so much. I want to answer this question too with a plug for investing in talent, retaining them, and supporting their growth. I'm seeing so much burnout happening all around us, and I saw a question about burnout pop up in the chat that we didn't get to. I think a large part of that is that we're not really listening to and supporting the people who hold these spaces. It takes a lot of a special type of energy to hold space for participation and to do the deep work of relationship building and trust. So I really want to encourage folks to like look at your hiring practices, look at your promotion practices, look at your well-being and support practices, and really, really deepen those and listen to your communities within your staff teams to do better there. So, we're at the end. I wish we weren't, because I could talk to you all day. I want to share deep, 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 deep gratitude to all who spoke today. Shadi, Kelly, Lisa, Pamela, Han, you guys are heroes. You're wonderful. I learn from you all the time. I appreciate you, and I can't wait to be in continued dialogue with you. I also want to thank Yelena and Katie and Serena behind the scenes and our captioner. Thank you all so much for all that you did to support this session. If we didn't get to someone's questions, tweet us. We'll amplify through our communities, and I know folks in the community will respond. And if you like what you learned today, feel free to join and/or make a donation to our respective communities. We'll include more information about both of those things in a follow-up email. But we're thrilled that you all showed up and gave us 90 minutes of your time today. So thank you for being here. We're ending on time. Have a great rest of your day, folks. Thank you. Thank you.